Welcome back. In today's video, we'll be diving into some unsettling stories that come straight from Reddit, so sit back, subscribe, and let's jump right into today's stories. Hell's Waiting Room. During my early 20s, I worked as a meter reader in Iowa City, Iowa. A meter reader is the person who records how much electricity, gas, or water you've used each month. If your meters are on the inside and you want an accurate bill, a meter reader must enter your home whether you're there to let them in or not. Just to clarify, we only entered homes if consent was given when the customer first signed up for service. Customers also provided us with keys if necessary. Entering a home when the owner isn't present is something that I never got used to. No matter how loudly I knocked, I never shook the uneasy feeling that I wasn't welcome. The inside of a home is the ultimate private space. A home's exterior is just the image of ourselves that we project to the rest of the world. But the further you venture inside, the closer you come to truly seeing what kind of person lives there. And if you want the raw, unfiltered truth, head for the basement. I hate basements. I've seen walls that look like giant static-filled TV screens until I realized it was roaches scurrying across a white background. Cobwebs so thick and dusty that it looked like the cotton candy machine exploded at the Spider County Fair. I've seen rats, snakes, feces, weapons, neglected children, abused pets, homeless squatters, massive hoards, bizarre sexual items, a makeshift meth lab, and even a coffin. There are rational explanations for all of these things. Well, maybe not the coffin. But there was one basement where what I found was beyond the grasp of logic. And that's what made it so terrifying. It was an old apartment house. From the outside, it looked like every other house on the block. I entered the back door and found myself at the top of a staircase. I ran my hand along the wall until it grazed a light switch. I flipped the switch, but no lights turned on. I wasn't carrying a flashlight. A typical route involved 5 or 6 hours of walking, so I carried as little as possible. Oftentimes I used the light from my handheld screen, but it only illuminated whatever was about a foot in front of it. So armed with the world's worst lantern, I made my way down into the darkness. Once at the bottom, I blindly shuffled across the room, one baby step at a time. With arms outstretched and head down, I eventually reached the far side of the basement. I shined the dim light from my handheld along the wall and discovered 2 doors. Each door led into its own small room. I chose the door on the right and found the meters in the far corner. As I entered the reeds, I began hearing noises coming from the other room. Something was moving, and there was whimpering that grew louder the longer I listened. I eventually realized it was a dog. It sounded weak and distressed. I tried to open the door, but it was locked. At this point, the dog was scratching the other side of the door. I felt helpless. I reported it when I got back to the office, but I couldn't shake the thought of that dog. It stuck with me over the next month until it was time to return. So there I was, 1 month later, back within that basement. At least this time I knew where the meters were located. I shuffled back to the little room on the right while keeping my ears open for any sounds coming from the other room. This time, I heard nothing. I read the meters and started making my way back, but I couldn't shake the memory of that dog. Was it still trapped inside that room? My curiosity got the best of me. I stood outside the door for a few moments, listening. Still nothing. That's when I made a huge mistake. I tried to open the door. I had no more than jiggled the doorknob when I first heard it. Screams. Blood-curdling screams unlike anything I'd ever heard. Sounds that I didn't think a human was capable of producing. Short, piercing, high-pitched shrieks followed abruptly by a low, drawn-out guttural moan that ultimately morphed into something that I can only describe as crying, but much louder. It was all over the place, like some sort of psychotic freeform jazz. I stumbled backwards, nearly losing my balance. I shouted something like, "Hello, who's in there?" There was no response, just screams. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" Still no response, just screams. There was no doubt that I yelled loud enough for him to hear me. He didn't want my help. He wanted me gone. I fumbled my way through the darkened room toward the exit. When I reached the top of the stairs, I just stood there, listening. I was trying to wrap my mind around what I was hearing. I waited for the screaming to stop, but it never did. When I finally left, it was still as loud and demented as when it began. I felt relieved, but that quickly vanished when I realized I had to do it all over again next month. I reported what I'd heard, but nothing came of it. As my return drew nearer, a sense of dread grew inside of me. What kind of lunatic sits alone in total darkness and silence? My mind created endless explanations for what kind of hell laid beyond that door. By the time I returned, I'd built him up in my mind so much that anyone other than the devil himself would have been a letdown. But there was no sign of him the next month, or even the next several months. I'd nearly given up on solving the mystery when a stroke of luck pulled me back in. One night, I went to a concert with my friend Laura. After the show, I gave her a ride home. She'd moved somewhat recently, so she had to give me directions. I didn't pay much attention to where she was leading me until she pointed to a house a ways up the street. I couldn't believe it. She had moved into the house with a mysterious room in the basement. This sounds weird, but have you noticed anything odd about the basement at this? I began to ask. But before I could finish my sentence, she blurted out, "A crazy guy lives down there." Finally, I had confirmation. She went on to tell me that even though her apartment was in the attic, she often heard him yelling late at night. But that wasn't all. She had actually met him. One day, while walking to her car, she saw him standing in the lawn. He stood perfectly still, with no expression on his face. He was directly in her path, so she cautiously made her way around him. She noticed he was staring at her, so she offered a friendly "hi" as she passed. He had no reaction, except for one unsettling exception. He stuck out his tongue, then quickly sucked it back into his mouth and resumed acting like a statue. Thoroughly creeped out, she got in her car and drove away. 2 or 3 months later, I finally met him myself. I entered the back door like I had so many months before. This time, something was different. There was a light on in the basement. I peered down the staircase. At the bottom, a ragged-looking dog was staring back at me. It was the same dog I'd heard during my first visit. Then I noticed something else. Behind the dog, I could see a pair of bare feet. The ceiling blocked my view of the rest of whoever was standing there, but it didn't matter. I knew it was him. I should have left right then, but I didn't. I know this probably doesn't make sense, but at this point, my desire to finally get some answers outweighed my fear. I shakily called out, "Meter reader," and started to make my descent. As I made my way down, more of him was revealed. He looked to be middle-aged. His head was shaved and his eyes were wild. He was wearing pants but no shirt. What I remember most was how lean and sinewy his body looked. It had the look of a body that was never at rest. I explained who I was and what I was doing there. To my surprise, not only did he talk to me, but he actually sounded somewhat normal. The volume and pitch of his voice was odd, but he said the same sorts of things that people typically said to meter readers. I even started to doubt whether or not he was the same man I'd heard screaming, but his behavior slowly removed all doubt. As I read the meters, he rapidly paced back and forth. He was constantly wringing his hands together and spastically cocking his head from side to side. The longer he talked, the more agitated he became. He began grimacing, and little verbal tics started popping up in his speech. Every so often, he'd blurt out aloud, "Ah!" in the middle of a sentence. He was trying to suppress these sounds, but he was losing the battle. I started to make my way to the exit. He followed. His verbal outbursts grew louder and more frequent. I was petrified. When I reached the stairs, I drew our conversation to an end and said goodbye. As I turned to head up the staircase, he could no longer hold it in. Screams. The very same unforgettable screams that I'd heard coming from the locked room. I ran up the stairs as fast as my legs would carry me, flung the door open, and rushed back into the daylight. A month or two later, I had a couple friends, including Lara, over to my place. I was excited to tell her about my encounter, but as I was relaying what happened, I could tell that something else was on her mind. When I finished telling my story, she told me about something she'd seen a couple weeks earlier. One day, she noticed lights flashing outside her window. She looked outside just in time to see police officers placing the man from the basement in the backseat of a squad car. She later found out from another tenant that he had attacked someone with a knife. That was the last we ever saw of him. I don't know what became of the man in the basement. I like to think that he got the help he needed, but maybe that's just because I'd rather not think about the alternative. The man in the brush. To give some explanation and background knowledge for this whole encounter, I was around 15 at the time this occurred. I was camping out in the middle of nowhere with my family and part of my extended family, my aunt, uncle, and cousins. I was the oldest kid there in the RV, so you can probably understand how it felt to have no one else to do the stupid crap I did back then with. With a good 2-year gap between me and the inferiors, it was almost like nirvana when I got to the campground and met the other teenagers. These were all people we knew fairly well from previous camping trips, so it was considered normal to hit it off with them from the start and act like we've known each other forever within the hour. Now, the story. My parents trusted me a lot, not a lie. I liked my fun, but I liked getting home in time for dinner equally as much, so when I was gone most of the day with other people from the camp, they didn't think much of it. The only rule was that I had to be back at the RV to eat dinner and before 8:30 p.m. in the evening. So picture this. Group of 6 teenagers, 15 to 16, out in the middle of the woods with no adult supervision for the vast majority of the day. Just a recipe for success right there. But this particular day, we found a neat little deer trail we hadn't found in the 2 years we'd been there before. On second thought, though, it didn't really seem like a deer trail. It snaked through a really thick part of the underbrush, maybe a foot, 30 centimeters of clear ground, 3.5 feet, 1 meter, clear of branches going upwards. It's a really hard thing to pick out of the brush unless you're either really looking or know where it is. It was promptly explored, marked with a broken branch outside of the entrance, and quickly forgotten, except I remembered this special little tunnel. That night, while we were all eating dinner, one of the adults proposed that we played manhunt out in the woods. At night. Not everyone was totally on board with this idea, but in the grand scheme of the plan, they were quashed down like autumn leaves. Everyone got a flashlight, and everyone was assigned to a team. For those of you who aren't sure what manhunt is, here's an explanation. Everyone playing is given a flashlight, and they are divided into 2 groups. It's basically like glorified flashlight tag, but there's a catch. As you catch people, you have to correctly identify who they are, and if you can, they join forces with the hunters. The last man standing gets a candy bar or something, whatever is being offered as a prize. This is how we played it anyways. For the first round, I get lumped in with the runners, those who are getting chased by the hunters. We get a 5-minute head start to run, climb a tree, whatever the hell we want to do to evade the hunters. Usually I'm the one up in the tree, but that never really worked out as being the winning spot. So, to try and score a win for once, I decide to play the cat and use one surefire method of escape. And the hiding spot was the rude little path through the thicket. It took most of the head start time to find the damn thing because it was so well hidden and out of the way. As I passed hiding spots, I heard hushed, smothered whispering between siblings who were questioning my actions, like a bird's wings rustling when it's fluffing itself. It should be noted that I have bat hearing. My ears are possibly my greatest asset in this game. But when I'm just reaching the destination, I hear the short blast of the air horn announcing that the 5 minutes are up. I swan dove into this minute little path in the undergrowth, shuffling on my hands and knees until I'm about halfway in, crouching down like some huge, malformed quail. The hunters are doing an initial sweep through the trails, looking for obvious hiders and people caught out trying to change spots. When they finally reach me, they reach the dead end and go straight back. I try to readjust myself and crawl further down the tunnel. I honestly don't know how it happened, but I found an even more hidden path within that one. And accidentally, I dragged my stupid body down the rabbit hole, except instead of ending in a dead end, this one ended in a slight hollow. I don't ever want to describe exactly what I found there. I'm sorry, but I just can't. It was a younger-looking woman, naked, covered in lacerations and stab wounds in the fetal position. Her glassy, glazed eyes seemed to look straight through me. I won't go any further than that. I was too scared to scream, and I froze there while dark burgundy stains formed on my jeans. I froze there, in a pseudo-catatonic position like a marble carving for what felt like hours. And then I heard someone else coming along that path. Have you ever been so scared that for one moment, one insane moment, you truly consider something incredibly stupid as a viable option to escape? That was one of those times. I let out a short, trembling whimper and started moving. Whoever was on the path stopped and then eagerly started moving forward again. I could hear their panting, uneven breaths of a man, a horrible marker of whoever it was getting closer and closer to me by the second. By some wondrous, beautiful miracle, he missed the path leading to the brushy hollow. I heard him moving down past the entrance, dragging something clunky and awkward behind him. I heard clinking noises, and the occasional effort to silence the small, sharp noises. I heard a low curse, somewhere towards the end of the tunnel, and I blasted out of the undergrowth tunnel like a bullet forcing its way out a barrel. Cracks, crashes, and obnoxious rustling was all around me as I heard the man sharply intake a breath and begin to move towards me. The hoarse, deep panting was getting closer and closer to me, a testament to how I was too slow at exiting. Somehow I exploded out of the entrance, got onto my wobbly, half-asleep legs, and started booking it down the trail. The unknown pursuer was close behind me for a bit, but it seemed like he was too exhausted to chase me at the same speed for long. I know everyone loves to rip on the fact that people a ways trip in horror movies, but in all honesty, tripping is something I am amazed I didn't do. With adrenaline coursing through me at the speed of Usain Bolt, trying to make my jello-like, unsteady walking appendages work to move me away from whoever was behind me was like trying to run on water. It felt like an eternity, but I finally reached the main trail running back to the camp and sprinted down it screaming bloody murder. Confused faces looked out from the trees, and I think someone called after me. Reaching the camp was easy, but trying to explain why I woke up half the people in the camp and bolted out of the woods at breakneck speed was harder. When I finally choked the words out to explain, I remember a profound, insidious silence throughout the group of adults waiting at the mouth of the trail. I really don't remember a whole lot from that point on. I know the cops were called, and my mother and aunt ran shrieking and wailing along the trail, calling for the other kids to come back to safety. When someone's yelling like that, you don't ignore it. They rounded everyone up in 30 seconds flat and barreled back into the camp. The police found a man out in the woods, creeping along the trail, clutching a knife. A black garbage bag with a plethora of sharp instruments and a saw was found abandoned on the trail, some speckled and smeared with dried blood. I don't think there's really any getting over it. I still have nightmares sometimes of the man chasing me, breathing heavily down the back of my neck, trying to catch me. Sometimes he succeeds. Story from across the border. This is one of my favorite subreddits, but I have noticed that most of the stories written here happened in the USA. Here is a little taste of the horrors we lived through south of the border in Mexico. This happened to a friend of my mother's relatives. A family of 4, Arturo, the dad, Maria, the mom, Eduardo, the son, and the Ana, the daughter, who happened to be extremely beautiful. They live in Mexico City, but as is common for upper middle to upper class families, they went to spend a long weekend to Acapulco, a vacation spot that frankly has seen better days as it was overshadowed by Cancun in the 80s. Acapulco had recently been the focus of gang-related warfare since homegrown gangs refused to cede territory to the powerful Sinaloa cartel. This inconvenience, however, did not completely stop the flow of tourists to the once gorgeous, now decadent port, and did not stop Arturo and his family, thing that they would later regret enormously. The family was dining in a restaurant next to the sea, enjoying the delicious seafood, when the waiter, clearly nervous, came to the table with a bottle of expensive champagne and a note. "This is from those gentlemen over there," he said, pointing at a table where sat 4 men that you could just tell at first glance were narcos, wearing gold chains, rings, and the like, and drinking Johnny Walker Blue Label. Arturo unfolded the note and read, "This is for you to have a toast with your daughter, as this is the last night you will ever see her." Arturo got up, left 1,000 pesos on the table for the meal, and they went straight back to the hotel, where, in terror, they made their bags and prepared to leave immediately. Along the way to Mexico City, there are several desolate stretches where all you can see is desert and perhaps some misshapen little houses and a gas station. Arturo stopped the car at one of those gas stations to fill up. As he was filling up, 2 cars suddenly pulled into the gas station, one parking in front and one behind the family's car. They had been followed. Several men exited the vehicles and pointed their AR-15 Estes at the family. They came to honor their word. They came for Ana. According to Arturo, there are few worse feelings than being powerless as you watch your daughter, screaming and kicking, being dragged into a car, which then speeds away over the horizon, never to be seen again. Strangers straight up tried to drown me. This took place about 10 years ago when I was a freshman in college. This is the first time I've recounted this story in full detail to anyone. I attended college in a rural mountain area in the Northeast, a small school tucked away in the rolling hills of the mountains, the type of place where the beauty and casual grace of nature is juxtaposed by the ugliness of humanity. The newspaper was ultra-conservative, and you couldn't sojourn too deeply into the woods beyond a few trees without seeing some trace of meth activity. You know the type of place I mean. Anyway, one of my new friends from college discovered somehow an abandoned train trestle deep in the woods about 5 miles from campus, in no man's land, basically. I don't remember how he found this place because it was very much off the beaten path. The trestle crossed above a river which placidly flowed about 40 feet below. It was actually quite beautiful, and we began going there maybe 3 times a week, just chilling on the trestle, watching the water below and the open sky above. We'd drink 40s there, smoke a bowl there, bring girls there. We began jumping off the trestle into the water below and then climbing back up. It was just a very college-y thing to do, our chill spot, basically. So one day, just needing to get away from the dorms and away from it all, I decided to go by myself to the trestle for a swim. It was about 7 p.m., so I still had a good hour or so of dim sunlight, and I brought a flashlight for the walk home when it was sure to be dark. I made the trek through the pathways of the woods as I had done 100 times before, left my towel and flashlight on the trestle, and jumped into the water. The water was about 10 to 15 feet deep, I'd say, and it flowed almost imperceptibly. You might as well be swimming in a stagnant pool. However, about maybe 50 yards away from the trestle, the river narrows and the current picks up significantly. Then about 20 yards after that, there is a maybe 20-foot high waterfall that bubbles and splashes with extreme violence. We used to watch large objects go over and never come up again. So there I am, dimly bobbing my head in and out of the water, doing underwater flips, etc. When I pop my head out of the water, I happen to glance to the side of the river and see a man walking towards the water. The water is kind of impeding my view, so I don't see him fluidly walking towards the water. I more see him in different stages of being closer to the water, like flipping through a flip book. He 15 feet away, 10 feet away, 5 feet away. I can barely give you a description, maybe 6 feet tall, pale, skinny, black hair pulled back in a ponytail. What I do remember most about his appearance was the extremely empty look on his face and in his eyes, like he was doing something mundane, taking out the trash or raking leaves. I'm treading water, not knowing what to think. and I see that he is no longer beside the river. He has dove in and is swimming pin straight directly at me so fast. I try to swim the opposite way, but within a minute I feel him grab my ankle and tug. I tried to scream, but water filled my mouth. While I'm underwater, he lets go and goes up for air, then grabs back on and pulls me again. It seems like he's done this before, and I never once see him after he jumped in the water. He's gradually pulling me to where the current picks up before the waterfall. I start to realize this and just fucking flipping out, kicking, screaming, cursing, to no effect. Finally, I feel the current start to take me, and as I twist away towards the waterfall, I look back and see this fucking guy just casually swimming back to where he jumped in the water, not even looking at me. This is by far the scariest moment of my life as I approach the waterfall. Long story short, I go over and am underwater for a long time, over a minute. The water above unrelentingly pushing me under. The only reason I survived was there was a large log that had gone over, and I grabbed it and leveraged it against the bottom to push me away from the crushing water. I survived, obviously. But then I had to trek the miles back to my dorm in the dark, without my flashlight, every step of the way, thinking he would come back to finish the job. The next year, a football player drowned going over that fall. The news said it was because there was an extreme current due to recent rainfall, but I've always wondered about that. The red minivan that haunted us for half a year in 2006. I've shared a few stories on here before, but this is the one that bothers me the most. It happened years ago when I was about 13 or 14. When I was a young teenager back in the fall of 2006, me, my family, and my neighbors started having bizarre encounters with an old man in a dark red minivan. Back then, I used to live on a hill above an old, non-operational fishing village. It was about a 40-minute drive outside of the city along a highway. The highway to the village was a dead end. There was nothing down that way except housing. There wasn't even motels or any stores. Most of the houses were homes to elderly people, while the others were abandoned fishing stages that overlooked the water. It was very strange to see anyone that we didn't recognize down in the area, especially from September till May. We would get the odd tourist during the summer months, but never from fall to spring. When I was in middle school, every day after I got home off the bus, I would walk up to the mailbox. It was about a good 15-minute walk along the highway. The mailbox was up the road towards the city. Past my house, there was only about 8 other houses, all on the same side of the road as mine. After those houses, it was just thick trees and marshes. I used to like to call the area Silentville instead of Silent Hill. We were right on the very edge of the East Coast, right by the ocean. It was a fog bank all year round. It was rare we would get sunny days. Even when it was sunny in the city, it was still foggy down there. Sometimes the fog was so thick you barely see a few feet ahead of you. Anyway, one afternoon after school, while I was on my usual trek back home after checking the mailbox, I heard the rattling of a vehicle in the distance. I always walked facing traffic since my mother would have a fit if I didn't. Safety rules and all. It was crawling towards me, its headlights clearing the fog. It was probably going about 5 miles per hour, which was odd considering the speed limit was about 70. The minivan came to a halt about 10 feet ahead of me, just stopped, right in the middle of the highway. I continued towards it. I figured it was someone looking for directions. As I neared the window of the car, I could see an old man sitting in the driver's seat. He was of a fairly small build, with light gray patches of hair on his head. His eyes were very watery and of a dull blue color. "Hello, young lady," he said in a very soft voice. "Hi," I responded. He started making small chat with me. I really can't remember what, but it was just sort of casual talking. I noticed he had a small, fluffy white dog in his passenger seat. The thing that really struck me odd about this dog was its body language. You see, this old man would move his hand a lot while talking. Every time he would quickly move it, his dog would sort of scrunch further back in its seat. It seemed a bit afraid of him. Another thing odd was he always kept his other hand between the two seats. I could sort of make out what seemed to be something of a metallic material under his hand. After chatting with me a bit, he slowly turned his head away, then continued up the road towards the city. I shrugged it off, just figuring he was a relative of someone down in the village, and continued home. About a week went by without seeing him, and by then he was just a memory. I was on my way up to the mailbox when I heard the familiar sound of rattling coming down the roads towards me. Him again? I thought. I was a little weirded out by him, so I jumped down into the ditch and hid in the brush. I watched as he sluggishly drove by. The entire time he was looking around, observing, sort of like a hunter looking for prey. After he was long out of sight and I couldn't hear his vehicle anymore, I jumped up from the ditch and hurried my way up to the mailbox. The last 6-minute stretch of road had no housing, so it was pretty isolated. After snatching up the mail, I started hurrying back, and that is when I ran into him again in the worst place possible, the long stretch with no houses. This time he was coming up the road quite fast. I didn't have time to hide. He pulled up next to me and said, "Hello, dearie, why were you down in the ditch earlier?" Oh shit, I thought. He had seen me. "Oh, I thought I had seen a cat down there," I said. "You like cute animals, dearie? You can get in the back seat and play with my puppy. She loves kids," he said, smiling. No thanks," I said as I started to walk away. He reached out of his window and grabbed my arm. "Please, dearie, I insist. I can drive you home. You live at my address, right?" I stood there dumbfounded. How did he know which house I lived in? I shook him off and started to run. He started backing his car up after me. I bolted down the road and didn't look back. At the time, my aunt lived a few houses up the road from my house, so I ran into her driveway and started frantically banging on her door. She came to the door and let me in. I used her phone and called my mother to come pick me up. After we got home, I told her everything. She was very upset and called the police. They basically told us they couldn't do anything, especially since we didn't have a license plate number. After that, I wasn't allowed to go on walks. He continued to show up. Usually twice a week, right after my school bus dropped me off, he would come driving slowly down the road. One day, my neighbor asked him what he was doing. He responded, "Oh, I'm just a lonely gentleman. I saw a woman one day down the road working on her garden, and she just captured my heart." My neighbor told him she was married. He just laughed and said something along the lines of, "If you want love to work, you have to work for it," then drove off. My neighbor got the license plate and called the police. About 40 minutes later, the police came down, but he was long gone by then. Our neighbor waved the police over and talked to them. They told him the car had been reported stolen a few months back. Sometime during November, my parents were out in the evening doing yard work. He stopped in front of our yard and was asking my parents where I was. He said he missed our time together and felt neglected. My parents got really upset and chased him away. A few days later, I was up late at night playing Final Fantasy XI on the Xbox 360 in the den. The den was on the bottom floor. I used to keep all the blinds open with the lights off in the room. I liked looking at the night sky. People could probably see me through the window since it was facing the street. So there I was, illuminated by the TV, all cuddled up in my big armchair having a late-night game session, probably about 2 a.m., and I see the familiar red minivan slowly coming down the road. I froze. It parked a few feet up the road from my property, in between our house and the house next door. There was a small driveway that led to nowhere going in between our land. He stopped his car, turned it off, then came out. I watched in horror as he walked closer to our house. I was terrified. I pushed myself as far back into the chair as I could, hoping he wouldn't see me. I felt like screaming, but my parents were upstairs and both were sound sleepers. He paced back and forth in front of our house, sort of staring. He was looking into the den. Now, this is the extremely strange part. He just stopped in place, then laid down on the side of the road in front of our house. He just laid there for a good hour. I was frozen with fear the entire time. After about an hour, he got up, then strolled back to his car and left. I ran upstairs crying and told my parents. They called the police again, but he was gone by the time they got to us. We were all frustrated. The police, despite having his license plate, couldn't do anything, and this guy was coming around harassing and terrifying us and our neighbors. This went on till about March. About a month passed without seeing him, and that is when we got the news. Our neighbor, who was good friends with someone that lived down a dead-end side road up a bit further, had been on a walk to his friend's house. He spotted the red minivan off in a driveway of a house that had just been put up for sale. The people were moved out. He got filled with anger when seeing it and ran over. When he got closer, he noticed blood on the passenger side window. He went to the closest house and used their phone to call 911. He went back over to the car to check it out. He was pretty ballsy. He was sort of the neighborhood protector. The car doors were unlocked. He looked in the window to see the small dog's body, a wallet, which had an ID in it, and a bloody wrench wedged between the two seats. He left and waited for the police to arrive. Our neighbor stayed in contact with the police. Apparently, the guy had left in a hurry, leaving his ID behind. Turns out he had just been released from prison not too long ago for offenses towards minors. We didn't get any details, though. I felt so horrible for the dog. I really hope he never got his hands on another animal again. I sometimes worry that he went on to harass other people the same way he harassed us. Alright, that wraps up the video. I really hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It helps out a lot. Also, leave a comment below with your thoughts on the video. I basically read every comment, and if it's good enough, I'll respond to it, so make sure to leave a comment and I'll try to get back to you. Thanks for watching. It means a lot. Until next time, see ya.